Keith, Damien, and Ann, welcome to CES 2021.
Thanks, Rajeev.
Applause. Virtual applause. We'll do virtual applause. Well, listen, let's start with kind of the first question. And we're beginning 2021. From each of your perspectives, what is the most important area for the industry to work on in either privacy or trust for this year? Ann, let me start with you.
Yeah, well, happy to be here, and thanks for including me. I think I should begin by just saying 2020, good riddance to 2020. Can we all agree on that at least? I think every Christmas card, every holiday card this year had that as the motif. And largely because we have had a really interesting year with COVID this year. For me, thinking about that, 2021 is going to be a year, I think, where we are going to have to raise the bar on how we think about trust in general. So when we think about how important technology is to our lives, I think the last several months in particular have really shined a light on how critical it's become. We wouldn't be doing this way if we didn't have internet access. On Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think right next to air and water comes Wi-Fi, right? And so technology has become an even more important part of our lives in 2020, and it will continue to be so in 2021. And so a lot of the things that I think we view as being fun to have or, convenient to have become really, very, very important, if not, essential in some of our lives. On the Alexa front, because I work on the Alexa product, we've seen more and more cases where people are using our product for very important interactions. So we serve a very large community of users with varying accessibility needs. For many of those customers, Alexa is not just a service that you can say, hey, Alexa, tell me a joke. It's a means for independent living. For families that have been separated by COVID, particularly people with elderly relatives from afar, Alexa Care has been a great product launch for us to help enable people to stay in touch and keep track of family members when they're living apart. Those kinds of use cases, for us, it raises the bar on how to be transparent about the controls and the privacy and the trustworthiness of the product. Just simply because it's not something that, once you become that important to a person's life in their daily interactions, I think it's just going to make it more essential for us to demonstrate again and again, over and over, the ways in which we're raising the bar on privacy and transparency and trust for our customers.
Awesome. And Karen.
Thanks, Rajeev.
Damien, my apologies. Damien.
Rajeev, you met my twin brother already this week, so I think there's plenty
I was having deja vu here, actually.
Yeah. Well, first of all, like Ann said, thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. I wish it was in person, but this will have to do for this year. So I think as we go into 2021 for Twitter, our big focus in this space is probably in transparency. Transparency is obviously something that's very important to Twitter, just conceptually across the board. But I think as we think about 2021 in the privacy perspective, it's really about transparency around AI and ML, I think is where we're going to be doing a lot of work. We try to make sure that folks understand kind of the quintessential what data we collect, how we use it, when we share it, all of those good things. But I think that becomes even more pertinent in the AI and ML sphere. And I think as those technologies become more ubiquitous to everything that we're using and doing online and in the world, I think transparency in that space is going to be an incredible driver of trust when it comes to privacy.
Awesome. Keith?
Sure. It's always tricky going third on a question like this when I so utterly agree with what I've heard from others. But I'll elaborate a little bit. I think when I think about 2020, one thing that I've heard from several people is they're trying to think through what the consequences are for all of us as we kind of look into the future. We've seen an acceleration of the adoption of technology and talked about how people are relying upon our products and services more than they have before. I think it's even more than that, right? Like people have long increasingly seen that their experience of the world is being more and more intermediated by technologies and by products and services from each of our companies and from many others. That, for privacy professionals, has always involved a certain level of anxiety and apprehension for users. It's always been a challenge for privacy professionals to make sure that users understand how information about them is being collected, how it's being used, what kinds of controls they have over it, and all of that. When you take that and you overlay it into what we've experienced for the last year and what we're looking at into 2021, users are feeling more nervous than they have in the past. They're relying upon technology more than they have in the past to live their lives and to do the things that are important to them, to look after their kids and their families and to stay connected with loved ones and their employers and everything else, to remain productive human beings. For us, the way we translate all of that into our responsibility and our priority into 2021 is we want to help do everything we can to keep users safe online. And that means a lot of things, right? That means continuing in the work that we've done in the past on privacy and data protection to do an even better job of explaining users, innovate on controls. But it also means doing things like helping to work across industry and with regulators and others to identify opportunities where we can meaningfully improve the privacy and security that governs users' behavior online. So there's a lot of work to do. There's a ton of opportunity. And we actually think that's an area where we can lean in and use our expertise. So hopefully as we're going into 2021 and we start thinking about returning to the real world and returning to work, we are doing everything we can to make sure that users continue to feel as safe and productive as they can when they're online.
Great. Well, listen, those are great. I think actually let's come back to all three of these topics. Maybe for the first discussion topic, and I'm just going to throw it out to whoever would like to field it. Any kind of discussion on privacy certainly starts with Europe. And so we saw sort of over the summer the invalidation of the Privacy Shield. Recently, we've seen drafts of the DSA, the DMA. There's also a DGA, and then there's maybe other alphabet soup combinations of kind of privacy rules. I guess the broad question here is, how do we see European privacy playing out, and what are the major implications for consumer tech companies?
Sorry, was that question for one of us, Rajeev?
No, just whoever wants to take it. Whoever wants to take it first. Whoever wants to start.
Got it. I'll take a run at it. Yes, clearly Europe has been an exceedingly important voice in the way that privacy and data protection law and regulation, and frankly, just the way we think about these issues. The European Charter sort of manifests privacy as a fundamental human right that has tremendous influence for the way that it's represented in their legislative and regulatory frameworks. And the passage of the GDPR in 2018 was a tremendous catalyst for companies all over the world to make sure that they were beginning to adapt their privacy programs through a more European lens, which then had spillover effects. US law and regulation has certainly become more European in some respects over the course of the last couple of years. And I think that trend is going to continue. That said, we are definitely in a period of incredible uncertainty. As you said, there are multiple legal regimes that are in a state of, I would say, unprecedented flux right now. And we are going to need a great deal of transparency, cooperation, and collaboration between the public and private sectors as we navigate the meanings of all of this and advance what I think is the indisputable shared goal of providing the strongest possible protections for users online, building trust, building confidence, helping make sure that there's continued economic growth and prosperity for as many people as possible around the world, while at the same time recognizing that there are other values in terms of freedom of expression, competition, and a vibrant and healthy and growing economic ecosystem. So we want to make sure that we are working with all the relevant communities so that we're addressing all of those obligations responsibly.
Damien, do you think, and maybe let's tackle kind of Privacy Shield's kind of invalidation first. Do you think that the invalidation of the Privacy Shield and then kind of more broadly regulations on data transfers will affect kind of user experiences and expectations kind of on a global basis?
I certainly think there's the potential for that to happen. I mean, something that we try to do constantly with the way Twitter provides its services, it's sort of this idea of a global experience, right? So like if I'm in Japan today, pre-COVID world, preceding travel, not today, but pre-COVID world, I travel from Japan and I go to California and I go on to Europe, that experience travels with me, right? I don't want to open the app and have a very different experience, both from the settings, the controls, the privacy experience, or just the online, the totality of it. And I think the challenge with things like what we're seeing with Privacy Shield or localization of data outside of the European context is this kind of potential for a balkanization of the internet, balkanization of services, localization of services. And that's obviously extremely challenging as sort of the industry side. But I think it's even more challenging for the consumers, right? Like Twitter is meant to be a place where I can join the global conversation. If my global conversation is limited to the data that's in the 28 or 27 countries of Europe, that's not a global conversation. It's a European conversation, right? So we kind of have to rely on the free movement of data across borders. And, while the sort of the fallout from Schrems is still being felt, I think, from Schrems, still not sure how it's going to land. Obviously, the early kind of changes with Privacy Shield. But I think there is the potential for a damaging impact both to industry and then to trust from consumers in terms of how these products and services work every day for them. And so it's something that we're actively focused on. We obviously are a global service, and we're engaged both with regulators, both sides of the Atlantic, and also with consumers to understand if they kind of fully appreciate the impact that this has for them. Right, because on the one hand, they read in the newspaper big win for sort of rights around their data in one sense, but they may not fully appreciate the impact to the service for them. And when faced with those two things, I think it becomes a very different discussion.
So I want to jump in if I can, Rajeev, because I think it's, you're really not having a wonky privacy conversation until you start talking about Schrems 1, Schrems 2, European Court of Justice, Privacy Shield. So we've gone straight to the heart of the matter. But I will say that, it's only been 2.5 years, really, since GDPR went into effect, which is such a short period of time. But even in that short period of time, I think we can agree that consumer awareness about privacy as an issue has dramatically increased globally, not just in Europe, but among just everywhere. I think there's awareness, and features that didn't exist except in a few small cases exist in a lot of services now. The ability to access and request all of your data portability as sort of a goal for many companies, the ability to delete and see all of the information that an organization holds about you. Those are things that didn't exist to the same degree that they do now. And in addition, having worked with a number of startups, I can tell you that they are in the enviable position of not having to retrofit privacy features into a product. They're able to build systems with the expectation and understanding that data will be accessed and deleted, and that customers have that control. And I think that's a huge improvement across the board, and we owe a debt of gratitude for that. If there is some confusion, but the benefits I think are already being seen.
So, Anne, picking up on kind of trust in GDPR, as you mentioned, we're 2.5 years after sort of the implementation. There's still a lot of skeptics on whether or not it's actually improved privacy. So, from your perspective, and this is maybe an early postmortem, this may be sort of a during mortem, maybe, but has GDPR, from your perspective, had a positive, a neutral, or a negative impact on trust for users in tech?
I think that's a good question and a hard one to answer, in the sense that I think the European perspective has always been rooted in law and regulation around data. So I think there's that sort of acceptance and it's a backstop, effectively, that I know that there's a law that protects me. And so I don't know that GDPR changed much for European customers. I think it's had more of an effect globally for data subjects, individuals who live in countries that don't have omnibus data protection laws. I mean, here in the United States, we may get regulation in this space. We have state level laws, but we don't have a federal privacy law, and it remains to be seen if we will get one in the Biden administration, right? That's a big open question. But I do think that in terms of raising awareness and changing people's behaviors and giving them access to more information and greater transparency, it has raised awareness of privacy in a very different way than we had prior to GDPR. So I guess that's my way of saying that I'm not going to perform the autopsy on this particular corpus just yet. We don't know.
Sure.
We don't know.
And then kind of Damien and Keith kind of turning to the U.S., kind of pivoting with Anne's comments. True or false to either of you? Actually, let either of you take it. True or false? A U.S. federal privacy law will pass within the next 2 years.
I will go true, because
true or false, and why?
True because I want to be optimistic here, because I think it's long overdue. I think there's some challenges to getting there, but I'm also cautiously optimistic because I think, and not to go all wonky, as Anne said, rightly so, but there are some incentives there, even from an international perspective, that make it a little bit more likely. So, for example, the challenges with cross-border movement likely increase the incentive on the federal government to act. And so I think the stars have been aligned for some time, but perhaps now as a new administration comes in, we can see that change. That they can fix the cross-border issue on its own in an executive order, or they can try and do it as part of a federal law. So I think the option is there on the table to try and do it as part of a federal law. Would be my preference. I think there's a good reason to do it, and I think there's bipartisan alignment to get there. But there's a lot of things on the administration's plate too.
Keith, what do you think? Next 2 years or not possible? Not likely?
He's muted.
Have we lost Keith's voice, everybody? We might have lost Keith's audio. Well, why don't we? There you go.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, echoing Damien.
I know you didn't want to answer that question, Keith. I get it.
I am an unshakable optimist, right? Like I do think we are closer than we've ever been before. If anyone looks at the last 20 years and the number of conversations where this question has been teed up, the safer bet was always to say no, that in part because privacy is such a bipartisan issue, getting legislation passed that doesn't get encumbered with a whole bunch of unrelated, irrelevant stuff has always proven challenging and ultimately fatal to these kinds of efforts. But I agree. I think the stars are better aligned than they have been in the past. I think one other thing that we are going to see that is creating a ton of leverage in the short term is the two laws in California, the CCPA and the CPRA. If history is any lesson, that is going to be a catalyst for a tremendous amount of state-level legislative activity across the next couple of years. That tends to dramatically increase the chances that we can develop the political will at the federal level to do something just to create a uniform rule of law so that companies know what the rules of the road are and individual users know what their rights and protections are.
Keith, to follow up on that, so today, and obviously the risk without a federal law is that we have a patchwork of state laws, which makes it kind of even more difficult for businesses to sort of operate and manage, especially startups. And so we have, I think today, if I'm right, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we have three kind of state kind of laws, three state privacy, consumer privacy laws. This is in California, Maine, and Nevada. And so if that number 3 is correct, how many additional states do you think will pass sort of omnibus consumer privacy legislation between now and a year from now? That number 3 will be what in a year?
So here I would say you're going way past my willingness to prognosticate and making a number out of thin air. What I would say is even that number 3 is somewhat creative, right? Like you're looking at broad privacy bills that have received a great amount of attention over the last few years. If you take a wider view, virtually every state in the country has some state level legislation that has significant privacy consequences. Sometimes they're industry specific, sometimes they exist in the context of consumer protection. The reality that we are all increasingly dealing with is data is driving everything, and therefore virtually any set of legal requirements are increasingly either being revised or reinterpreted to be legal requirements affecting the movement and governance of data. So I would actually argue we are already dealing with quite a patchwork. There are 2 future states that we're contemplating. The one that I think you'll find all of us are advocating for is a reasonable preemptive federal bill that will give clarity. There is, of course, another failure mode, which would be a federal law that does not provide clarity. You could, in fact, have a federal law that allows for continued variation state to state, doesn't resolve those ambiguities. That's a risk that I think we're all going to have to make sure that we're proactively engaging with to make sure that we get a good law.
Keith almost said the word preemption, I think there. Was that what you were? But I mean, globally, there are over 100 different, national level privacy laws around the globe. While we have 3, you mentioned 3 states, there's absolutely been regulation at the city level and the municipal level. So when you start to add it all together, it is a patchwork quilt. And I think even if we do get an omnibus federal privacy law, it's not going to be GDPR either, right? So there are going to be differences always. And and all of us here represent companies that operate at global scale, and so you're always trying to. We're dealing with a forever patchwork quilt, I think. But we're trying to minimize the differences, and we're trying to hopefully give all of our customers everywhere, a fair shake and an equal amount of privacy protection.
But this Rajeev, if I can just jump on that, Anne is absolutely right. But I think this is where it's actually incredibly important for the federal government, as it thinks about this, to really understand about the international future of this, because it sort of ties back to the question of like a divided internet, divided services. If we get this wrong, not to put too much weight on it, but I think it is this important, you increase the chances for that balkanization of things, right? These laws need to be interoperable. If they're not, the sort of Schrems Privacy Shield dilemma is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of localization of both services and data and then the internet. And that's not an outcome that any of us want to see.
So the FTC in December had a 6B order to actually all three of the companies here, as well as 6 others, kind of on data practices. And there's some kind of discussion that the results of this, which may take kind of 1 or 2 years to put together, might form the basis of either kind of federal kind of privacy law or revisions of it if it's passed between now and then. And what was astonishing is there was a 4-1 vote. So there's kind of, it's not a partisan issue. There's bipartisanship. What is the implication of this 6B order from your perspective?
I'll take a stab at it. So I think, look, we only got it like 4 days ago, if even at this point.
Oh, Damien, don't tell people that. Don't tell people we're recording in December. So to everyone, this is pre-recorded, so we've time-stamped us. But
you haven't digested the thing, Rajeev. So look, I think it's actually super important to be continuing to sort of, and I mean this in a positive sense, educate the FTC and the teams at the FTC, because I don't think they fully understand the complexities about the way these services operate, right? Both the data that they use, how they operate to benefit and increase trust for people. So I'm actually optimistic that through the 6B, we can actually use that as a tool to both educate the people that are thinking about how they might inform future legislation, but also future regulation in this space. And so, we're going in optimistically in terms of what we'll do. It's going to take a little bit of time to unpack it all, but I think it'll be an interesting opportunity.
Keith or Anne, again, recognize that it has been kind of 3 days since the order was issued. Kind of your thoughts.
Yeah, so I mean, again, consistent with what Damien is saying, I can say, having practiced before the FTC for the better part of 20 years at this point, and having practiced internationally extensively for the last 10, there is, I think, a widespread perception that the most aggressive privacy regulation happens somewhere else. That's not consistent with the facts. If you look closely, you would have to recognize that the FTC has been as aggressive and as sophisticated as any regulator anywhere on earth on issues of privacy. And exactly what Damien would said, I would much rather have a regulator engage with me from a well-informed, well-reasoned position, even if they disagree with me. I am confident that my company is acting in the best interest of our users and in a manner that is consistent with both the letter and the principle of law. I want to have that conversation with the regulators that are standing over me. So we welcome this kind of engagement. I think the FTC does an exceptionally good job of it. And again, I'm optimistic about the outcome.
I'll only just say that I am the only non-lawyer among my peers here. And even though
I'm right there with you, Anne. I'm right there with you.
But yeah, so while this may have come 3 days ago, it didn't come to my office because I am not part of the legal team. But I will just echo in general that I think there's been greater collaboration between companies and regulatory agencies and authorities in understanding and describing and sharing more knowledge about the way these services work. That's been a big part of the dynamic in the last few years, especially as more and more of these agencies have been hiring technologists to understand how technology works. I think that collaboration is super important, whether we're talking about how these specific services work or whether we're talking about how machine learning and artificial intelligence works. There's a lot of complexity in technology, and that is only getting more and more of an issue that we're grappling with. So the more that we can talk these things out and have these kinds of conversations, hopefully the better the outcomes will be.
And then staying with kind of U.S. kind of landscape again for just another question, what do you expect the Biden administration to sort of focus on? And I guess what would you like to have the Biden administration focus on? in privacy?
Sure. I mean, I think the Biden administration is going to have a lot on its plate. So I expect that privacy and data protection will be one thing on a very long list of extremely important work that they'll be taking on early in the year. I will say, a couple of years ago, we released a framework for legislation, which I would encourage folks who are interested to go and have a look at. It's publicly available. Broadly speaking, what we are looking for is strong, consistent protections for individual rights. Uniformity of controls so that users, to Damien's early point, it's helpful if users have a consistent experience when they're interacting with online services wherever they are in the world. Having consistent guidance, uniform rule of law, and things like data portability, which not only protect privacy, but they're also useful from a competition perspective, keeping ecosystems vibrant and open. So again, I would point folks to that work. I am hoping that the administration will take a look at some of our thought leadership in the space in the past, and we hope that they'll continue engaging with industry so that we can work out a lot that's great for users.
And Damien, as the fellow lawyer on the session here, your thoughts on how the Biden administration will approach privacy and what you'd love for them to focus on.
Yeah, I think it's not dissimilar to what Keith has already said, and I think we've kind of covered a little bit earlier on. The only addition I would have to Keith, and it's doubling back to where we were earlier, I do think addressing sort of the privacy shield dilemma in the early stages. Again, if that's done through the prism of a federal privacy law, great, fantastic. If it's some separate mechanism, fine, maybe not as preferential, but that I think it's an important step in probably the first 180 days would be my suspicion to resolve that.
Right. And I would just also remind everyone that, in the Biden administration, Vice President-elect Harris was the Attorney General of the state of California and very, very involved in the issue of privacy through her office there. So I absolutely expect that, and many of these companies are based in that state. So I would expect that there will be movement on this, and I would expect her office, hopefully that experience will come into play as they think through the administration's approach.
So now let's back up kind of at the highest level for a moment here and talk about kind of consumers' kind of point of view. And Anne, maybe I'll just sort of start with you and sort of how you had talked about kind of raising the bar kind of on privacy and trust with users. What do you think is the state of the bar today? And then, are things like, for example, is informed consent just not possible, kind of given the kind of complexity of technology today? Talk to me a little about kind of strictly from a consumer point of view, kind of where the bar is today and what's possible or not possible.
Well, I think, we can't always raise the bar. I think that is the ongoing challenge of improving our privacy features and controls. I'm with Damien on the importance of transparency, and certainly that has been one of the most sort of notable hallmarks of Alexa and the product that I work on is giving our customers access to information, not just about what we collect, but giving them direct access to that information and control over it. The thing that is interesting, I have only been at Amazon now for going on about 5 months. And I actually went through this whole interview process and joined, and I've never actually met any of my team members in person because everything has been remote. So it's been a really interesting process. But you hear a lot about customer obsession with Amazon. You hear about it all the time, and you can sort of think of it from outside the organization, like, oh, that must be a platitude. But when I showed up and sat in on these meetings, I realized, like, wow, this is like every single conversation within the organization that I've been a part of starts with, how is this feature, product, how is this helping the customer? How is this going to benefit the customer? How is our data collection and use going to help the customer? So there is a real commitment within many of these organizations to ensuring that we're actually delivering something of value for what we're collecting from our customer. So I think that in that way, I would say that there is a continuing progression of privacy features that certainly that Amazon and the Alexa team has been beating that drum consistently. Every product release is coupled with a privacy feature release. And privacy itself is becoming an area, not just as a sort of a thing we do to serve the needs of regulators, but a thing that we present to customers and expect them to use. And more to the point, I would just say that it's an area of innovation in and of itself. And I think that. And then,
Anne, your thoughts on sort of informed consent, and trust and informed consent?
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned, artificial intelligence, machine learning. These are not the type of technology that, if you think about the capabilities of technology and what we're able to do, it's definitely exceeded, I think, the capacity of a lot of lay people to understand how it works. So that means even more than before, the notion of not just providing transparency, but really leaning into the conversation around explainable technology, trying to use terms that people understand. It's harder and harder. I will not lie, it is a challenge. But it's incumbent upon us to find ways to make it more approachable, which I think we're trying to do.
And then, Damien, kind of circling to you in terms of transparency on machine learning and AI. Talk to me a little about that in terms of kind of impact on consumers and their trust and privacy.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I know there's a bit of a debate. Debate's a strong word, but folks vary on this idea of a privacy paradox, right? There's been lots written on it, and I will kind of stay out of the debate, other than to say that when folks don't have access to what has been done with their data, after the fact, if there is an issue, they are certainly very concerned about it. So this is where I think transparency needs to be made available. And it's sort of up to the end consumer to decide whether they want to avail of that transparency, but it should be available to them. And that's trust building, right? So it means before I engage with the service, I can know what it's going to do, or while I'm engaging with the service, I know what it's doing. And then I can make a decision through things like stopping usage of the service or porting my data to another service, and sort of vote with my feet, but not sort of voting on like the data itself. I get this level of transparency into what's being done, and I can control whether I'm okay with that through a variety of mechanisms. So I think transparency is just an incredibly empowering tool for trust, right, as a result. But it can come in a bunch of different flavors and formats. For AI and ML, I think the way the world is headed is more around explainability. Some folks think it's about the ability to just turn on and off algorithms. I don't realistically think that that's going to be an option. I think it's going to be more in the explainability and like, what is this doing and on what data?
Yeah, we totally agree. We actually have a company in the space that we think very highly of. I've got some company-specific kind of questions here. Oh, Keith, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, no, there's one more point that's kind of an orthogonal of that I think is interesting. One thing that I have seen over and over in my years in the space is what I think is an increasingly erroneous presumption that there is a tension between privacy and usability, or privacy and efficacy, or privacy and utility. There is I think a tension in design philosophy where folks are saying, if we begin putting our thumb on the scale to prioritize privacy, it is in some way to the detriment of the core design imperative, the thing that we are really trying to do or deliver. We had this great insight, this epiphany across 2020. As many of you know, we collaborated with Apple on building out an exposure notification system to support national health authorities in their ability to contain COVID-19. Early on in the course of that work, we were firmly committed to optimizing the entire system for privacy for an array of reasons. Of course, because we had to do it, but also because to drive user adoption, we knew that we needed to be optimizing for trust. And we knew that folks were going to be skeptical and apprehensive about sort of the signing on to an exposure notification system. So we knew that privacy was a fundamental element of it. We ran into a ton of friction at the front end of that project from folks across industries. There were technical people in public health, people in government who entered the conversation from a position of presuming you are leaning too hard on privacy. You are making the product less effective. You're going to impair our ability to do our mission in protecting people and saving lives. And we held our ground with humility and kind of engaged in that dialogue. And where we ended up landing, and where I think people on all sides of the conversation learned, was we could actually improve the functionality of the product. We could launch the best exposure notification platform possible by optimizing for privacy. And that was a really novel insight. And I think that same insight is going to increasingly cascade into other areas of innovation. AI, ML, there's a ton of stuff happening in AI, ML right now, which there are new innovations occurring that are allowing folks to realize you can continue making these incredible advances in the capabilities of AI ML systems and do it in a privacy protective way. So if we can check the presumption that privacy is somehow corrosive or detrimental to the other things that matter, I think we'll make a lot more progress a lot more quickly.
All right, so I've got some company-specific lightning round questions for each of you, and feel free to opine on each other's questions, but let me start with kind of each person kind of in turn. So Keith, the first topic, the topic that I have for you is on tracking. And so kind of two-part question, and then 1 minute or less if you could. How is Google's phase-out of third-party cookies going? Will you stick to 2022? And then are you supportive of Apple's app tracking transparency changes?
Sure. So on the first part of the question, we have made a commitment to phase out third-party cookies in Chrome. We are proceeding. There are a few things that we are trying to encourage to happen along the way. We are trying to cultivate a third-party ecosystem using the Privacy Sandbox to figure out a way to continue funding a free and open internet in a way that is even more privacy protective than the version of the internet that we know today. We're confident we're moving in the right direction there. And
2022? Is that?
Well, yeah, that's where we're headed.
Okay, great.
As far as the Apple's anti-tracking, I think that the direction that Apple wants to proceed in terms of protecting users, we are 100% aligned on. And as you can say, we're doing things in Chrome, we're doing things in other areas to try to optimize for user privacy. I think some of the moves that Apple are making are a fairly blunt instrument, and we're seeing some of that play out right now publicly, where different folks are raising questions saying that the rules that Apple is unilaterally promulgating might not work optimally in every circumstance. But I think we're going to see that play out over the course of the next year.
Awesome. Damien, question for you is on the GDPR kind of fine, the first in sort of history for a U.S. tech company, 450,000 euros. And obviously it took 2.5 years or something, 2 years or something like that to get kind of this first sort of enforcement action. And you guys took responsibility and have really been very supportive of their process. The two-part question for you, was 450,000 enough to assuage sort of negative behavior in the industry, and is this a precursor for more fines to come, in your view?
So, in terms of whether it's the fine is enough, I think at the end of the day, if you look at what the transgression was, which was notifying outside of the 72-hour window, and just so we're all on the same page, we're talking about hours, not days, over the 72-hour window. So I think a 450,000 euro or $500,000 fine for what is hours late is probably a disincentive. It sets a fairly hard line to folks that 72 hours means 72 hours, right? In terms of whether we'll see more fines, we absolutely are going to, right? Particularly from the Irish regulator, the Irish authority has made public that she has a number of ongoing investigations, including into Twitter and others. I'm sure Keith and his team and colleagues of Anne are working on these as well. So we'll obviously see more. I think what I've appreciated with how the Irish regulators approach things is sort of the depth of effort that they've tried to put into the process, which unfortunately has publicly played out a little bit badly insofar as it's made it very slow, and I think that's frustrated a lot of people. But I have to commend them for putting in the effort that they have to making sure that they get the process elements right. But there's definitely going to be more fines in the near term.
And Anne, we're going to have 1 minute left, and so you're going to be the last. So as Alexa moves into conversational, self-learning, interactive learning kind of use cases, how do you think about privacy in those use cases?
Well, Alexa is a voice-forward device, right? And so we spent a lot of time thinking about the privacy implications of having a voice-activated device. First and foremost, with wake word, that is you have to invoke a wake word before Alexa is perking up and listening and streaming data to the cloud. We use a lot of visual cues. I have an Echo Studio sitting behind me. If you notice, it has a red light. That red light means the mic has been disabled. It is not actually possible in the device to have that red light on and have the mic be operational. They are wired in such a way to make it impossible. But when that light turns blue is when Alexa is streaming data to the cloud. So we're working on a number of different features. Also, you can say, Alexa, why did you do that? Alexa, delete what I just said. Alexa, delete everything I've just said. So we are trying to make that user interface consistent with that voice forward experience that has been foundational and part of the very core of the product in the 6 years that it's existed.
We have run out of time. I want to very much thank Keith Enright, Damien, Karen, and Ann Toth. This was a great super session at CES. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.